After months of carefully monitoring a mysterious glowing plant in his abandoned greenhouse, what it finally produces leaves a struggling farmer speechless and in tears. This discovery will not only save his failing farm, but change countless lives across the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Veteran farmer Mike Sullivan had seen just about everything in his 40 years of working the land. His family farm in Montana's Bitterroot Valley had weathered droughts, floods, and economic downturns. But nothing could have prepared him for what he discovered that crisp autumn morning. The past decade had been particularly harsh on his farm, with changing weather patterns and rising costs forcing him to abandon several greenhouses and scale back operations. What was once a thriving operation producing premium organic vegetables for high-end restaurants across the state had dwindled to barely subsistence farming. That morning started like any other, with Mike making his routine check of the property. As he passed by one of the abandoned greenhouses, something caught his eye, a faint blue-green glow coming from between the dusty panels. At first, he thought it must be a reflection from the morning sun, but curiosity got the better of him. Using his old keys, he pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside. There, breaking through the cracked concrete floor, was a plant unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its stem seemed to pulse with an inner light, and its leaves had an iridescent quality that made them appear almost metallic. Mike stood transfixed, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. In all his years of farming, in all the agricultural journals he'd read, he had never encountered anything like this. The greenhouse had been abandoned for nearly 3 years, ever since the devastating hailstorm that had shattered most of its panels and forced Mike to consolidate his operations. He'd simply couldn't afford the repairs back then. Now, amidst the dust and debris, this extraordinary plant had somehow taken root and thrived. Mike approached carefully, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he knelt beside the plant. It stood about 2 feet tall with broad, silvery leaves that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. The stem was thick and sturdy, unlike any conventional crop he'd grown before. What struck him most was how the plant seemed to respond to his presence, its leaves gently swaying despite the complete absence of wind in the sealed greenhouse. His mind raced with possibilities. Could this be some sort of new species? A mutation? Or perhaps something that had been dormant in the soil, awakened by the unique conditions in the abandoned greenhouse? As a third-generation farmer, Mike had inherited not just the land, but also his father's and grandfather's extensive knowledge of agriculture. They had taught him everything about traditional farming. But this was something entirely different. The financial pressure of recent years weighed heavily on Mike's shoulders. The farm's debt had been mounting, and he'd already sold off several pieces of equipment just to keep the basic operations running. His daughter Sarah, who had recently graduated from agricultural college, had been helping him explore new revenue streams, but nothing seemed promising enough to turn things around. Standing in that greenhouse, Mike felt a familiar stirring of hope in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago when he'd first introduced organic farming methods that had initially made the farm so successful. But this time, the stakes were even higher. At 62, he wasn't just fighting to innovate, he was fighting to save his family's legacy. Mike pulled out his phone and began documenting everything about the plant, its height, the unusual coloring, the strange luminescence. He took several photos, though they hardly did justice to the plant's otherworldly appearance. As he examined it more closely, he noticed something even more extraordinary. Tiny, pod-like structures were forming along the stem, each one containing what appeared to be some sort of developing fruit or seed. The decision he faced now was crucial. Should he report this discovery to agricultural authorities? They might take over and quarantine the entire farm. Should he try to cultivate it himself? The plant could be dangerous, but it could also be the miracle his farm desperately needed. The possibility of a new, unique crop species could mean the difference between losing everything and creating a revolutionary breakthrough in agriculture. After hours of contemplation, Mike made his choice. He would keep this discovery to himself, at least until he understood more about what he was dealing with. He carefully cleared the debris around the plant and began preparing the greenhouse for proper cultivation. Years of experience had taught him that patience and careful observation were crucial when dealing with unknown variables in farming. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the greenhouse panels, Mike took one last look at his mysterious discovery. The plant's gentle glow seemed even more pronounced in the dimming light, like a beacon of hope in the darkness. He secured the greenhouse door and headed back to his house, his mind already formulating plans for the days ahead. Little did Mike know that this strange plant growing through the cracked concrete of his abandoned greenhouse would not only challenge everything he knew about agriculture, but would also become the key to saving much more than just his family farm. Over the next few days, Mike threw himself into renovating the old greenhouse. Every spare moment between his regular farming duties was spent clearing debris, patching broken panels, and creating the optimal environment for his mysterious discovery. The work was exhausting, but for the first time in years, he felt energized by a sense of purpose. His daughter Sarah noticed the change in him immediately. "Dad, you're up to something," she said one evening, watching him gather supplies from the tool shed. "You haven't worked this hard since we tried that hydroponic system 3 years ago." Mike hesitated, weighing his words carefully. Sarah had always been his confidant, the one who shared his dreams for the farm's future. But something held him back from sharing this particular secret, at least for now. "Just trying to salvage what we can from the old greenhouse," he replied, avoiding her knowing gaze. "Waste not, want not, right?" Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. She'd inherited not just his auburn hair, but also his stubborn determination. If her father wasn't ready to share, no amount of questioning would make him do so. Meanwhile, the mysterious plant continued to develop in ways that both fascinated and unnerved Mike. The pods he'd noticed were growing larger, and the plant's bioluminescence seemed to pulse in distinct patterns, especially at night. He began keeping a detailed journal of his observations, noting every change, no matter how small. Day 7. Plant height now 2.5 feet. Pods showing distinct segmentation. Day 8. Luminescence appears to intensify during evening hours. Day 9. New growth appearing at base. Possible secondary stems? Day 10. Pods developing metallic sheens similar to leaves. One afternoon, while examining the pods up close, Mike noticed something extraordinary. The largest pod had developed what appeared to be tiny crystalline structures on its surface. They caught the light like diamonds, refracting it into brilliant rainbow patterns across the greenhouse walls. His hands trembled as he made a careful sketch in his journal. The discovery of the crystalline formations brought new questions and concerns. What exactly was he dealing with? The plant's behavior defied everything he knew about botanical science. He spent hours researching online, looking for anything similar, but found nothing that matched his plant's unique characteristics. The stress of keeping such a massive secret began to take its toll. Mike found himself jumping at unexpected visitors to the farm, worried that someone might discover his project before he understood what he had. He installed new locks on the greenhouse and began making his observations at odd hours to avoid attention. His neighbor and fellow farmer, Tom Martinez, noticed the renewed activity around the old greenhouse. "Finally fixing up that eyesore, Mike," he called out one morning, leaning against the fence that separated their properties. "Need any help?" Mike forced a casual smile. "Thanks, Tom, but I've got it handled. Just trying to salvage what I can for storage space." The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. The Martinezes had been good neighbors for 20 years, always there when help was needed. But the potential magnitude of his discovery made him cautious about trusting anyone. As the days passed, Mike's concerns grew alongside his excitement. The plant now had several offspring growing around it, each showing the same otherworldly characteristics as the parent. The original plant's pods were swelling, some nearly the size of apples, with the crystalline formations becoming more pronounced. He knew he needed expert help, But who could he trust? The university agricultural department might seize control of his discovery. Private companies would likely try to exploit it. And if the plant turned out to be dangerous, he could be held responsible for not reporting it immediately. One night, unable to sleep, Mike sat at his kitchen table reviewing his journal entries. The financial statements from the bank lay beside his notes, a stark reminder of the farm's precarious situation. They had 3 months before the next loan payment was due, and their savings were nearly depleted. The mysterious plant might be their last hope, but it could also be their downfall if handled wrongly. Sarah found him there the next morning, still poring over his notes. "Dad, you need to tell me what's going on," she said firmly, sitting down across from him. "You're not sleeping, you're barely eating, and I saw you installing security cameras around the old greenhouse. This isn't like you." Mike looked at his daughter, seeing not just his child, but a talented agricultural scientist in her own right. She had graduated top of her class, and her innovative ideas had already helped several local farms improve their yields. Could he trust her with this secret? Should he? The weight of secrecy suddenly felt unbearable. He needed someone to share this burden with, someone who could help him understand what he was dealing with. But just as he opened his mouth to explain, a bright flash from the direction of the greenhouse caught their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see an intense blue-green glow pulsing rhythmically in the pre-dawn darkness. Mike's heart raced. In all his observations, he'd never seen the plant emit light that powerful. Something was happening. Something big. He jumped up from the table, nearly knocking over his coffee. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "I think it's time I showed you something, but you have to promise me that what you're about to see stays between us. At least for now." The look in his eyes must have conveyed the gravity of the situation because Sarah simply nodded, no questions asked. As they hurried toward the greenhouse in the growing morning light, Mike realized he was about to cross a point of no return. Whatever happened next would change everything, for better or worse. As Mike and Sarah approached the greenhouse, the pulsing light grew more intense. Mike's hands shook slightly as he fumbled with the keys, his breath visible in the cool morning air. When they finally stepped inside, Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in astonishment. The mysterious plant had transformed overnight. The pods that Mike had been monitoring for weeks were now splitting open, revealing something extraordinary within. Each pod contained what appeared to be perfectly formed crystals, but unlike anything either of them had ever seen. They weren't just reflecting light, they were emanating it, pulsing with that same blue-green energy that had drawn them here. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her scientific training warring with her disbelief. "What exactly am I looking at?" She moved closer, her eyes wide with wonder. The crystals were roughly the size of golf balls, each one multifaceted and seemingly alive with internal light. Mike explained everything, finding the original plant, his weeks of secret observation, his hopes and fears about what it might mean. Sarah listened intently, her expression shifting from amazement to concern and back again. As a recent agricultural science graduate, she immediately grasped the implications. "We need to test these," she said finally, her professional demeanor taking over. "These crystals, they're unlike anything in current botanical literature. The bioluminescence alone is extraordinary, but the crystalline structure in a plant pod? That's completely unprecedented." Over the next few hours, Sarah conducted preliminary examinations using the farm's modest testing equipment. What they discovered left them both stunned. The crystals appeared to be organic-inorganic hybrids, something that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional biology. "The energy readings are off the charts," Sarah muttered, checking and rechecking her instruments. "And look at this." She pointed to a strange pattern within one of the crystals, visible under her portable microscope. These structures, they're almost like tiny solar cells, but far more complex. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they discovered something even more remarkable. The crystal's glow intensified when exposed to direct sunlight, and the energy readings spiked dramatically. It was as if they were not just storing solar energy, but amplifying it somehow. Mike's mind raced with possibilities. If these crystals could really harness and amplify solar energy, the applications could be revolutionary. But with such a discovery came enormous responsibility and risk. The wrong move could lead to disaster, either through misuse of the discovery or by attracting unwanted attention. Their discussion was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the greenhouse door. Through the foggy panels, they could make out Tom Martinez's familiar silhouette. Mike and Sarah exchanged panicked looks. They hadn't been careful enough about being seen entering the greenhouse. "Mike? You in there?" Tom called out. "Saw the lights from my place. Everything okay?" Mike quickly covered the plant with an old tarp while Sarah gathered up her testing equipment. "Just a minute, Tom," he called back, his voice strained with forced casualness. When he finally opened the door, he positioned himself to block the view inside. Tom peered around him curiously. "Quite a light show you had going on in here. Some kind of new growing system?" His eyes narrowed slightly, noting Mike's defensive posture and Sarah's hastily hidden equipment. "Just experimenting with some new LED grow lights," Sarah jumped in smoothly. "For my research project at the university, Dad's letting me use the old greenhouse as a test space." Tom nodded slowly, clearly not entirely convinced, but too polite to press further. "Well, if you need any help, you know where to find me." As he turned to leave, he added, "By the way, saw some strange folks asking questions at the diner yesterday. Scientists or government types wearing suits. Someone said they were investigating unusual energy readings in the area." After Tom left, Mike and Sarah looked at each other in alarm. Had their discovery already attracted attention? The crystal's energy signature must be stronger than they realized. They needed to act fast. "Dad, we need help," Sarah said firmly. "Professional help. But we need to be strategic about who we trust." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through contacts. "Dr. Elena Rodriguez at my university. She's brilliant, ethical, and most importantly, she operates independently of major corporations. She might be our best shot at understanding what we're dealing with while keeping it contained." Mike ran his hands through his graying hair, weighing their options. The appearance of mysterious investigators changed everything. They were no longer just dealing with a scientific discovery. They were in a race against time. "Make the call," he decided finally, "but tell her to come alone and swear her to secrecy before revealing anything." He looked back at the covered plant, its glow still visible through the tarp. "Whatever this is, whatever it can do, we need to make sure it's used the right way." Sarah nodded and stepped outside to make the call, leaving Mike alone with their discovery. He carefully lifted the tarp and stared at the gleaming crystals. In all his years of farming, he'd hoped to leave a legacy, to contribute something meaningful to the world of agriculture. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. As he watched, another pod began to split open, revealing its luminescent treasure. The sight filled him with equal parts hope and fear. Whatever happened next would change not just his life, but potentially the entire world's understanding of what was possible in nature. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived at the Sullivan farm just before sunset, her old Subaru kicking up dust along the private road. Sarah had vouched for her expertise and discretion, but Mike still felt his stomach tighten with anxiety as he watched the vehicle approach. After decades of keeping their land private, inviting an outsider to examine their discovery felt like jumping off a cliff. The botanist stepped out of her car, carrying a heavy equipment case. She was shorter than Mike had expected, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Sarah greeted her former professor with a warm hug, while Mike hung back, studying the woman who might hold their future in her hands. "Professor Rodriguez, thank you for coming on such short notice," Sarah said, leading her toward the greenhouse. "And thank you for agreeing to keep this confidential. After that cryptic phone call of yours, how could I resist?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled, but her expression turned serious as she added, "Though I must admit, I'm both intrigued and concerned by all this secrecy. Before entering the greenhouse, Mike insisted they review the non-disclosure agreement Sarah had prepared. Dr. Rodriguez read it carefully, her eyebrows rising slightly at certain passages, but signed without hesitation. "Now," she said, adjusting her glasses, "show me what's so extraordinary that it required me to drive 3 hours without telling anyone where I was going." The moment they entered the greenhouse, Dr. Rodriguez froze. The setting sun streamed through the panels, making the crystals sparkle with unprecedented brilliance. The original plant had now produced over 24 of them, each pulsing with that otherworldly blue-green light. "Dios mío," she whispered, approaching the plant with reverent caution. "In 30 years of botanical research, I've never—" She trailed off, already pulling scientific instruments from her case. "May I?" For the next 2 hours, they watched as Dr. Rodriguez conducted a series of tests, her excitement growing with each new discovery. She analyzed the plant's structure, the crystal composition, the energy readings, muttering to herself in a mix of English and Spanish. "This is beyond revolutionary," she finally declared, looking up from her equipment. "The crystalline structures aren't just storing solar energy, they're transforming it. The efficiency rate is, well, it's impossible according to everything we know about photosynthesis and energy conversion." She showed them the readings on her specialized equipment. A single crystal this size is producing as much energy as a standard solar panel 10 times its size. And it's not just solar. It appears to be converting other forms of ambient energy as well. Heat, kinetic energy, even sound vibrations. It's like nothing we've ever seen in nature. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances. "So you think this could be valuable?" Mike asked cautiously. Dr. Rodriguez laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Valuable? Mr. Sullivan, what you have here could revolutionize clean energy production worldwide. If we could understand and replicate this process—" She paused, her expression growing serious. "Which is exactly why we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed." She began pacing the greenhouse, her mind clearly racing. "The energy industry would kill for this technology, and I mean that literally, the wrong people getting their hands on this." She shook her head. "We need to protect this discovery while we study it properly." Just then, they heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Mike's heart nearly stopped as he saw 2 black SUVs pulling up to the farm. Through the greenhouse's panels, they could make out several figures in dark suits emerging from the vehicles. "The men from the diner," Sarah whispered, remembering Tom's warning. Dr. Rodriguez moved with surprising speed, packing up her equipment. "Is there another way out of here?" she asked urgently. "We need to move this plant and its crystals immediately. I've seen this before. If those are who I think they are, they won't let something this valuable slip through their fingers." Mike's farmer's instincts kicked in. Years of protecting his crops from natural disasters had taught him to think fast in a crisis. "The old root cellar," he said. "It connects to the drainage system we installed years ago. Runs all the way to the back of the property." They quickly, but carefully, began gathering the crystals and uprooting the smaller plants that had sprouted around the original. Dr. Rodriguez provided careful instructions on how to transport them safely. "The plant appears to be extremely resilient," she explained, "but we can't risk damaging any of these specimens." As they worked, they could hear voices approaching the greenhouse. Mike's hands shook as he lifted the heavy trapdoor hidden under old storage containers, revealing the earthen steps leading down to the root cellar. Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez carefully carried the plants down, while Mike stayed behind to remove any obvious signs of their work. Just as he was about to join them, the greenhouse door opened. A tall man in a black suit stood in the entrance, flanked by 2 others. "Mr. Sullivan?" he called out, his voice professionally pleasant but carrying an undertone that made Mike's skin crawl. "I'm Agent Phillips, from the Department of Energy. We'd like to talk to you about some unusual energy signatures we've detected in this area." Mike Sullivan had faced many challenges in his life, but none had prepared him for the art of deception. Standing in his greenhouse with 3 government agents, He forced himself to appear calm, while his daughter and Dr. Rodriguez hid below with their extraordinary discovery. "Energy signatures?" Mike repeated, feigning confusion. "Can't say I know anything about that. This greenhouse has been abandoned for years." He gestured to the dusty corners and broken panels he hadn't yet repaired, thankful now that he hadn't finished all the renovations. Agent Phillips smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we take a look around?" Without waiting for permission, he nodded to his colleagues, who began methodically scanning the greenhouse with sophisticated-looking equipment. "Interesting readings here," one of the agents muttered, focusing on the area where the plant had been. "Residual energy patterns unlike anything in our database." Mike's heart hammered in his chest, but years of haggling with bank managers and insurance adjusters had taught him how to maintain a poker face. "Could be from the old grow lights," he suggested. "Used to run a pretty sophisticated hydroponic system before the storms took out half the roof." Agent Phillips studied him carefully. "Mr. Sullivan, we've been tracking unusual energy signatures across this region for the past month. They seem to be centered on your property. Would you care to explain that?" Below ground, Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez, and their precious cargo moved quickly through the narrow tunnel of the old drainage system. The passage was barely tall enough to stand in, with earthen walls supported by timber beams installed decades ago when Mike's grandfather had built it. "Where does this tunnel lead?" Dr. Rodriguez whispered, carefully cradling one of the smaller plants. "There's an old storm shelter near the back property line," Sarah replied, leading the way with her phone's flashlight. "Dad maintained these tunnels in case we ever needed to move water during the drought seasons." The crystalline formations continued to pulse with their ethereal light, creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the underground passage. Dr. Rodriguez noticed something remarkable as they moved. The crystal's glow seemed to intensify whenever they passed electrical wiring embedded in the tunnel walls. "Extraordinary," she murmured, making mental notes. "They're responding to the electromagnetic fields. The implications for energy grid integration could be—" "Professor," Sarah interrupted gently, "maybe we should focus on getting to safety first?" Above ground, the interrogation continued. Agent Phillips had produced a tablet showing various thermal and energy scanning readings. "These patterns suggest some form of biological energy source," he said, his tone growing harder. "Something that, according to our scientists, shouldn't be possible. Whatever you're hiding, Mr. Sullivan, it's already attracted attention far above my pay grade." Mike thought of his father, who had always taught him that the land belonged to those who worked it, not to men in suits with government badges. "Look," he said, drawing himself up to his full height. "I've worked this farm for 40 years. If something strange was happening here, don't you think I'd know about it?" Just then, one of the agents called out from the corner of the greenhouse. "Sir, we've got something." Mike's blood ran cold as the agent bent down near the root cellar entrance, but instead of finding the trapdoor, the agent held up a small crystal fragment they had missed in their hasty evacuation. Agent Phillips took the crystal, studying it under the fading daylight. The fragment still held a faint glow pulsing softly against his palm. His expression hardened. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid we're going to need you to come with us. This facility is now under government quarantine." Meanwhile, in the tunnel, Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez, and their precious cargo had reached the storm shelter. It was a solid concrete structure, built during the Cold War and maintained by Mike's family ever since. Sarah quickly input the access code and they hurried inside. The shelter was small but well equipped, with emergency supplies, a generator, and, most importantly, a ham radio system that Mike had kept operational out of habit. Dr. Rodriguez immediately began setting up her equipment on an old workbench. "We need to document everything," she said urgently. "These plants, these crystals, they're not just a scientific breakthrough. They could be the answer to the global energy crisis, but if they fall into the wrong hands—" Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from Mike. "DOE agents here. Don't come back to house. Implement Protocol C." Protocol C was something Mike had established years ago during a period of agricultural corporate espionage, a plan to protect their most valuable crops and research. Sarah never thought they'd actually need to use it. "We need to move again," Sarah said grimly. "This shelter is officially listed in county records. It won't take them long to find it." Dr. Rodriguez looked up from her equipment, her face illuminated by the crystal's pulsing light. "I have a colleague in Canada," she said. "She runs an independent research facility completely off the grid. If we can get these specimens there—" A distant rumbling interrupted her. Through the shelter's small window, they could see more black vehicles arriving at the main farm complex. The situation was escalating faster than any of them had anticipated. Sarah made a quick decision. "There's a storage facility in town, converted from an old mine shaft. Dad keeps an emergency vehicle there. If we can reach it—" She paused, worry creasing her brow. "But we can't leave Dad behind. Your father is buying us time," Dr. Rodriguez said gently. "The best thing we can do is protect this discovery. These plants, what they can do, it's bigger than any one person. It could change everything." As the sun set over the Sullivan farm, two dramas unfolded simultaneously. In the main house, Mike sat across from Agent Phillips in his own kitchen, watching as other agents methodically searched his property. They had allowed him to remain in his home, but the subtle presence of armed guards by each door made it clear he wasn't truly free to leave. "Let's try this again, Mr. Sullivan," Agent Phillips said, his patience wearing thin. "The energy signature we detected is unlike anything our scientists have ever seen. It has the potential to be either an unprecedented breakthrough or a serious threat to national security. Which one it is depends largely on your cooperation." Mike thought of Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez, hopefully safe in the storm shelter by now. He thought of the miraculous plant and its crystals, and what they could mean for the world if developed properly. But most of all, he thought about his family's legacy. 3 generations of Sullivans who had worked this land with integrity. "I'm just a farmer," he said steadily, meeting Agent Phillips's gaze. "Whatever your equipment picked up, it's probably just some anomaly from my old equipment. I've got plenty of defunct solar panels and experimental growing systems lying around." Meanwhile, in the darkness behind the property, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez carefully made their way through the woods, carrying their precious cargo in specially padded cases from the professor's equipment. The crystal's glow was both a blessing and a curse, providing light to guide their way, but also making them more visible to any searching eyes. "We need to mask the luminescence," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, pulling some emergency blankets from her pack. As they wrapped the cases, she continued her earlier observations. "The energy output is actually increasing. These crystals aren't just storing energy, they're growing stronger." Sarah paused, processing this information. Could that be why they detected it? Is it going to keep getting more intense? Before Dr. Rodriguez could answer, they heard the distinctive whoomp-whoomp of helicopter rotors in the distance. Searchlights began sweeping across the tree line. "They're taking this even more seriously than I feared," Dr. Rodriguez muttered. "Sarah, there's something you need to know. In my early career, I worked on a classified project studying biological energy sources. What your father discovered, we only theorized something like this might be possible. The implications are staggering." They crouched behind a fallen log as a searchlight passed overhead. Dr. Rodriguez continued in a hushed voice. "These crystals aren't just an energy source. They're a bridge between organic and inorganic energy processing. They could revolutionize everything from solar power to battery technology, but in the wrong hands, they could be weaponized," Sarah finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. Back at the house, the interrogation took a darker turn. Another agent entered the kitchen, whispering something in Phillips's ear. The senior agent's expression hardened. "Mr. Sullivan, we've found traces of an unknown biological substance in your greenhouse. Our preliminary tests suggest it's unlike anything in our database. At this point, your silence isn't just obstruction, it's a potential threat to national security." Mike felt the weight of every one of his 62 years as he replied, "I've spent my entire life growing things that help people. That's all I know how to do." "Then help us understand what we're dealing with," Phillips pressed. Our scientific division is already setting up a mobile lab. Whatever you've discovered, we have the resources to develop it properly, safely. For a moment, Mike was tempted. The government would have resources he could never dream of. But then he remembered Dr. Rodriguez's reaction to the crystals, her immediate understanding that this discovery needed to be protected, not just developed. In the woods, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez finally reached the access road that led to town. The old mine shaft storage facility was still 2 miles away. As they caught their breath in the shelter of a drainage ditch, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from Mike. They know about the plant. Get to safety. Trust no one. Love you. Dr. Rodriguez studied the latest crystal readings on her portable equipment. The energy signature is becoming more coherent, she whispered. It's as if the crystals are communicating with each other. I've never seen anything like it. Suddenly, the crystal's pulsing changed rhythm, becoming more intense. Through the wrappings, their blue-green light grew stronger, and the professor's equipment began beeping urgently. The ambient energy readings are off the scale, Dr. Rodriguez said, her scientific curiosity warring with her concern. They're responding to something. A loud humming filled the air, and all the lights in the distant farmhouse went dark. In the sudden blackness, the wrapped crystal cases glowed like captured stars, impossible to hide. They're not just responding, Sarah realized, watching as every electronic device around them went haywire. They're protecting themselves. The helicopter's searchlight flickered and died, and they could hear the aircraft's engine sputtering as it was forced to make an emergency landing. Car alarms began going off in the distance, and the entire valley was plunged into darkness, except for the ethereal glow of their precious cargo. Your father's discovery, Dr. Rodriguez breathed. It's more than just a new form of energy. It's alive, and it's evolving. The blackout transformed the valley into an otherworldly landscape. In the darkness, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez watched in astonishment as the crystal's pulsing light began to synchronize, creating patterns that seemed almost like a heartbeat. Their equipment, despite being battery-powered, remained dead, all except for Dr. Rodriguez's most basic radiation detector, which was clicking frantically. This is remarkable, the professor whispered, her scientific mind racing to understand what they were witnessing. The crystals aren't just disrupting electrical systems. They're creating some kind of electromagnetic sanctuary around themselves. It's as if they've developed a defense mechanism. Sarah thought back to the early days after her father's discovery. The original plant, it grew through concrete, thrived in an abandoned greenhouse. We thought it was just hardy, but what if it was more than that? What if it was adapting, evolving, to protect itself? In the distance, they could hear the chaos their escape had triggered. Emergency vehicles were responding to the blackout, their sirens mixing with the sounds of confusion from the nearby town. The helicopter that had been searching for them sat silent and dark in a field, its crew probably as baffled as everyone else by the sudden technology failure. At the farmhouse, the situation had become even more tense. Agent Phillips and his team were scrambling to understand what had happened to their equipment. Battery-powered flashlights cast eerie shadows on the walls as they tried to raise their command center on backup radio systems. This is exactly what we were afraid of, Phillips said grimly, turning to Mike. Whatever you've been hiding, it's clearly more dangerous than even we anticipated. This is now a matter of national security at the highest level. Mike sat quietly in his kitchen, illuminated only by emergency lighting. He thought about Sarah, about the incredible discovery they'd made, about the choice that lay before him. The agents were right about one thing. The power of the crystals was beyond anything they'd imagined, but they were wrong about its nature. Meanwhile, Dr. Rodriguez had made a stunning observation. Sarah, look at this, she whispered, pointing to one of the crystal cases. The crystals inside weren't just glowing, they were gradually changing shape, their facets realigning like living geometry. They're adapting to our presence, she explained, her voice filled with wonder. Just like the original plant adapted to grow in the greenhouse, these aren't just energy sources. They're a new form of life, one that bridges the gap between organic and inorganic matter. Sarah remembered her advanced biology classes. Symbiosis, she said suddenly. The plant and the crystals, they're not separate things, are they? They're part of the same organism. Dr. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. A life form that can shift between organic and crystalline states, harvesting and storing energy in ways we've never seen before. The implications are, well, they're beyond revolutionary. As they watched, the crystal's light began to pulse in a new pattern, more complex than before. Dr. Rodriguez's remaining working equipment detected subtle changes in the surrounding air temperature and electromagnetic field. They're not just defending themselves, Sarah realized. They're trying to communicate. Back at the house, Mike had come to a decision. The power outage had given him an opportunity, and he intended to use it. While the agents were distracted by their failed equipment, he slowly made his way toward his office where he kept his most important documents. Among them was an old journal belonging to his grandfather, something he hadn't thought about in years. In it, his grandfather had documented strange lights and unusual plant growth in the valley dating back to the 1940s. At the time, everyone had dismissed the old man's stories as fairy tales. But now, Mike quickly photographed the relevant pages with his dead cell phone's camera, knowing the images would be there when power returned. If he was right, their discovery wasn't just a random mutation, it was something that had been trying to emerge for generations. Meanwhile, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez had reached the outskirts of town. The storage facility was just ahead, but the blackout had brought people out into the streets, making it harder to move unnoticed. The crystal's glow, though muted by their wrappings, still posed a risk of discovery. As they crouched behind an old pickup truck, Dr. Rodriguez shared her theory. These life forms, they're not just evolved, they're evolving right now in response to our presence. The energy disruption isn't random. It's creating a space where they can safely transform. Sarah thought about the implications. So, when Dad first found the plant, it probably sensed his presence and adapted to appear as something he would protect, a rare plant species. But its true nature, what it's becoming, I don't think even I fully understand it yet. A new sound cut through the night, heavy military trucks approaching from the highway. The government's response was escalating, just as Dr. Rodriguez had feared. If they get their hands on these crystals, she warned, they won't try to understand them. They'll try to control them, weaponize them, and in doing so, they might destroy something miraculous. Suddenly, the crystal's pulsing changed again. The temperature around them dropped noticeably, and both women watched in amazement as frost patterns began forming on nearby surfaces, patterns that matched the crystalline structures they were carrying. It's not just adapting, Sarah whispered in awe. It's teaching us, showing us what it can do. Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Which is exactly why we need to protect it. Your father's discovery. It's not just a new energy source or even a new life form. It might be the key to understanding evolution itself, how life adapts, grows, transforms. The old mining storage facility loomed before them, its metal doors gleaming faintly in the crystal's pulsing light. Sarah quickly input the access code, her fingers trembling slightly as military vehicles rumbled in the distance. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous space that stretched deep into the hillside. Dad keeps an emergency vehicle in the back, Sarah explained as they made their way through the darkness, along with supplies, documents, everything we might need if the farm was ever threatened. Dr. Rodriguez marveled at the family's preparation. You Sullivans have been protecting this land for generations, haven't you? Perhaps that's not a coincidence. As they moved deeper into the facility, the crystal's behavior changed again. Their light began to illuminate the rock walls in strange ways, revealing patterns in the stone that weren't visible under normal light. Dr. Rodriguez stopped suddenly, her scientific curiosity overtaking her sense of urgency. "Sarah, look at these mineral formations," she whispered, pointing to the wall. "They're almost identical to the crystalline structures we're carrying. These rocks are millions of years old, but the patterns—" Sarah understood the implication. "Whatever this is, it's been here all along. The plant didn't just appear in Dad's greenhouse, it was awakening." Back at the farm, Mike had managed to slip away from his guards during the confusion and make his way to the farm's old library. Among the agricultural journals and family records, he found what he was looking for: his grandfather's original land survey from 1943. The margins were filled with notes about living lights in the soil and plants that sang to the stars. Everyone had thought his grandfather was losing his mind in his later years. The family had quietly hidden away his journals, embarrassed by his fantastic stories. But now, reading through the faded pages by flashlight, Mike recognized the truth. His grandfather hadn't been crazy. He'd been the first to witness something extraordinary. In the storage facility, Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez reached the emergency vehicle, a sturdy off-road truck equipped with solar panels and extra batteries. But as they prepared to load their precious cargo, the crystals underwent their most dramatic transformation yet. The cases they were carrying began to vibrate, and the blue-green light intensified until it was almost blinding. The temperature in the cave dropped dramatically, and ice crystals began forming in the air around them. "They're responding to something," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice filled with wonder. "The mineral deposits in these walls, they must be triggering some kind of resonance." The crystalline formations they'd been carrying started to change shape, growing and restructuring themselves before their eyes. The organic plant material they'd been connected to began integrating more fully with the crystal structures, creating something entirely new. "It's not just evolution," Dr. Rodriguez breathed, watching the transformation. "It's revolution, a completely new form of life that combines organic and inorganic elements in ways we never imagined possible." Sarah's phone suddenly buzzed back to life. The crystal's electromagnetic interference was changing, becoming more focused. A message from her father appeared. "Military convoy heading your way. Presidential order issued. They know about Grandpa's research. Get out now." But before they could move, bright lights flooded the storage facility's entrance. Agent Phillips's voice echoed through a megaphone. "Doctor Rodriguez, Ms. Sullivan, the facility is surrounded. For your own safety, and for the security of this nation, come out with your hands up." The crystals pulsed faster, their light creating intricate patterns on the cave walls. Dr. Rodriguez studied them intently, her eyes widening with realization. "They're not just patterns," she whispered. "They're instructions. Look, the molecular structures, the energy flows. It's like they're trying to show us something." Sarah watched as frost patterns formed on the truck's windows, matching the crystal formations exactly. "They've been trying to communicate all along, haven't they? Everything. The plant in the greenhouse, the energy pulses, even this transformation. It's all been about making contact." Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Your father's discovery, it's not just a new form of life. It's a message from the earth itself, showing us a new way to work with nature instead of against it." Outside, they could hear the military vehicles moving into position. Agent Phillips spoke again. "We have authorization to use whatever force necessary. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." But inside the facility, something remarkable was happening. The crystal's light had begun to synchronize with the mineral deposits in the cave walls, creating a cascade of illumination that spread deeper into the mine. The temperature fluctuations stabilized, and the air itself seemed to hum with potential. "They're not just showing us something," Sarah realized, watching the display with growing understanding. "They're offering us a choice." Dr. Rodriguez agreed, her face illuminated by the pulsing lights. "A choice between fear and understanding. Between treating this discovery as a weapon or as a gift." She turned to Sarah, her expression determined. "Your father protected this discovery because he understood something instinctively. Some things are too important to be controlled. They need to be nurtured. Understood. The sound of boots on gravel told them their time was running out. But as the military approached, the crystals performed their most astonishing transformation yet. The light began to coalesce, forming patterns that seemed to reach into the very fabric of reality itself. "Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, "I don't think we're the ones who need to escape. I think we're the ones who need to bear witness." As military forces surrounded the old mining facility, the scene inside had transcended anything human eyes had witnessed before. The crystal's light had transformed the cave into what looked like a living observatory, with patterns of energy dancing across the walls in increasingly complex formations. Sarah and Dr. Rodriguez stood transfixed, understanding they were witnessing something that would change humanity's understanding of life itself. "They're showing us their origins," Dr. Rodriguez whispered, her scientific training struggling to process what she was seeing. The patterns on the walls had begun forming what looked like a molecular history, showing transformations from simple mineral structures to increasingly complex crystalline organic hybrids. Back at the farm, Mike had made a discovery of his own. Deep in his grandfather's journals, he found a pressed leaf unlike any he'd seen before, silvery and partially crystalline, preserved between the pages with a note. "They're waiting for the right time, for someone who will understand." Mike's hands trembled as he photographed the leaf with his now functioning phone. His grandfather hadn't been documenting something new. He'd been recording the first awakening. The plant in the greenhouse hadn't been a random mutation. It had been waiting, dormant in the soil for decades until conditions were right. In the cave, the military's patience was wearing thin. "Final warning," Agent Phillips called out. "We're preparing to breach the facility." But inside, the crystals had begun their most extraordinary display yet. The light patterns had coalesced into what appeared to be a three-dimensional model of Earth's biological and geological systems, showing how energy flowed through every living thing, every rock, every particle of soil. "It's not just about energy production," Sarah realized, watching the display. "They're showing us how everything is connected, the plants, the minerals, the light itself. It's all part of one system." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "Your father's discovery isn't just a new form of life. It's a missing link showing us how life itself might have first emerged on Earth. The bridge between mineral and organic matter that we've been searching for all along." The display shifted, showing how the crystalline structures could integrate with existing biological systems, enhancing them without destroying them. It was a blueprint for a new kind of symbiosis between the organic and inorganic world. "This is why they revealed themselves now," Dr. Rodriguez continued, her voice filled with emotion. "With our planet in crisis, they're offering us a solution, not a weapon to fight over, but a gift to help us evolve." Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed again, another message from her father. "Found Grandpa's old research. The whole valley is full of them, dormant in the soil. They've been waiting for generations. Don't let them take control. Let them show us the way." The sound of breaching charges being set echoed through the cave, but the crystal's response was unexpected. Instead of retreating or defending themselves, they began to shine brighter, their light penetrating the rock walls themselves. "Look!" Sarah pointed to where the light touched the cave walls. Tiny crystalline structures were emerging from the rock face, pulsing with the same blue-green energy. The entire cave system was coming alive. Dr. Rodriguez checked her instruments, which were now functioning in strange new ways. "The energy signature, it's spreading. Not just here. I'm picking up similar readings from all over the valley. They're all awakening." Outside, the military's equipment began malfunctioning again, but differently this time. Instead of shutting down, their devices started displaying the same patterns that filled the cave. The molecular structures, the energy flows, the blueprint for a new kind of sustainable energy. "They're not hiding anymore," Sarah realized. "They're revealing themselves to everyone." Agent Phillips burst into the cave with his team, weapons raised, only to stop short at the sight before them. The crystalline growths had spread across the ceiling and walls, creating a cathedral of living light. Their tactical gears displays were overwhelmed with data, all showing the same message, a way forward that didn't require force or control. "This is bigger than national security," Dr. Rodriguez said, stepping forward to address Phillips. "This is about the security of all life on Earth. These beings aren't a threat to be contained, they're teachers showing us how to heal our planet." The crystals pulsed in agreement, their light forming patterns that even the military observers could recognize. Sustainable energy systems, pollution remediation methods, ways to restore damaged ecosystems. It was an instruction manual for planetary restoration, written in the language of light and life itself. Sarah's phone lit up one final time, a message not from her father but broadcast to every device in the area. "For generations we have waited in the soil of this valley, watching humanity's progress. Now, as your need has grown dire, we offer our partnership, not as a resource to be exploited but as allies in the evolution of life itself. The choice is yours." The message was accompanied by images from all over the valley, similar crystalline structures emerging from the ground, each pulsing with the same blue-green light, each offering the same choice: collaboration over control, understanding over fear, evolution over exploitation. 1 year later, the Sullivan farm had become unrecognizable. Where abandoned greenhouses once stood, crystalline structures now rose from the earth like transparent cathedrals, their surfaces pulsing with that now familiar blue-green light. Inside each one, plants grew with unprecedented vigor, their growth enhanced by the symbiotic relationship with the crystal formations. Mike Sullivan stood at the edge of his property, watching as another group of scientists made their way up the drive. Since that fateful night in the mining facility, his farm had become the world's premier research center for what the media had dubbed biocrystalline technology. But, unlike the military's original plans for the discovery, this research was open, collaborative, and focused on healing rather than weaponry. "Dad," Sarah called from one of the new greenhouses, "Dr. Rodriguez's team just made another breakthrough." She rushed over, her face glowing with excitement. The past year had transformed her too, from a recent agricultural science graduate to one of the leading researchers in an entirely new field of study. Inside the main research greenhouse, Dr. Rodriguez was carefully documenting the latest development. The crystalline structures had begun teaching them how to integrate their energy-producing capabilities with traditional crops. The result was a new form of agriculture that produced both food and clean energy in abundance. "It's remarkable, Doctor," Rodriguez explained, showing Mike the latest data. "These plants aren't just growing faster and producing more yield. They're actually helping to clean pollutants from the soil and air. The crystals are showing us how to restore balance to damaged ecosystems." The government teams that had once sought to control the discovery had been transformed into partners in understanding it. Even Agent Phillips, who now served as a liaison between the research center and Washington, had become one of their strongest advocates. "Your grandfather was right all along," Mike said quietly, pulling out the old journal he now kept with him always. "He wrote that they were waiting for the right time, for people who would understand. He just never imagined it would be his own family." The success of the Sullivan farm had inspired similar transformations across the globe. As more crystalline growths awakened in various locations, each adapted to its local environment, offering solutions unique to each region's challenges. In desert areas, they showed how to harvest water from air. In polluted cities, they demonstrated methods of purifying air and soil. Sarah walked with her father to the original greenhouse where it had all begun. The first plant still grew there, now surrounded by its crystalline progeny, a living testament to the moment when everything changed. "You know what amazes me most?" Sarah said, watching the lights pulse through the structures. "They could have shown themselves to anyone at any time, but they chose our farm, our family." Mike smiled, understanding now what his grandfather had known all along. "Because we were ready to listen," he said. "Not to control or exploit, but to learn and grow alongside them." As the sun set over the valley, the crystalline structures began their nightly light show, sending patterns of energy dancing across the sky. Local families often gathered to watch, bringing their children to witness the harmony between human innovation and natural wonder. The transformation hadn't just saved the Sullivan farm, it had shown a way forward for the entire planet. Universities worldwide now had departments dedicated to biocrystalline studies. Clean energy production had revolutionized economies. And perhaps most importantly, people had begun to understand that the line between organic and inorganic, between natural and artificial, was far more fluid than anyone had imagined. Dr. Rodriguez joined Mike and Sarah as they watched the evening light show. "I remember when we thought we were protecting a scientific discovery," she said, thoughtfully. "We never imagined we were actually being invited to participate in the next step of Earth's evolution." Mike thought about his father and grandfather, about their dedication to this land, and about the legacy they had unknowingly protected for future generations. The struggling farm he had once feared losing had become something far greater, a beacon of hope for a troubled world. "You know what the best part is?" he said, watching as another crystal formation emerged from the soil, its light pulsing in harmony with its neighbors. "This is just the beginning. They're still teaching us, still showing us new possibilities, and all we had to do was be willing to learn." As night fell over the Sullivan farm, the crystalline structures continued their ethereal display, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come not from conquering nature, but from learning to grow alongside it. The black eggs had been just the beginning of an incredible journey that would continue to unfold for generations to come. In the end, what had started with a farmer's tears of desperation had transformed into humanity's tears of joy, as we realized we were not alone in our desire to heal our world. We just needed to learn to listen to the quiet wisdom that had been waiting in the soil all along.